Did quite the makeshift job there.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's still up there.
Another career.
Okay, it's 10 o'clock. We have a quorum. I'll call the Electoral Area Service Committee of March 13, 2024 to order. The chair will acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territory of the Lachwitach people, and the next item of business will be an adoption of the public agenda.
Move adoption.
Second.
Thank you. Any discussion or anything? Seeing none, call a question. All in favor? And that is carried. Petitions, delegations, BC Housing Delegation, representatives of the Ministry of Housing. Who have we got here?
So, Mr. Chair, we have made several requests for someone from BC Housing to join us via Teams, and they have let us know that they are unavailable. A request for us to have them for 10 minutes via Teams, and they seem that they're too busy to accommodate that. What Aniko has done, though, and if the chair wants to, we can have a conversation in terms of Aniko sent out a request to directors for questions, of which she's received answers back from BC Housing to those questions, and I'm sure Aniko can speak to those. And as well, I don't know if you want to, if Aniko feels comfortable with it as well. There was also some survey results that we've been pouring in. If maybe you want to.
We got something there, Aniko?
Allude to that. So I'll leave it to Aniko's discretion because we don't have someone from BC Housing here.
Thank you through the chair to the committee. We did send through a number of questions to the ministry, most of those stemming from questions that have been posed from the directors here and a couple from staff as well. They are quite lengthy. There's 12 questions in total. Perhaps we could pass around the questions and answers, but I don't know that there's enough time to really go through them in any detail today. There is some clarity in the questions that we've posed and the answers that have been provided, but there still are some areas where it appears those questions have yet to be answered or the process is yet to be determined. So I still do think that there's some questions that need to be answered. The staff of the ministry apparently are available in the near future for a staff-to-staff discussion. I don't know what that might look like, but perhaps if we were to pass around these questions and the directors peruse them, we could follow up with the ministry staff on any additional questions, or if there's still some uncertainty in the answers that are provided here today. We do also have a short-term rental survey that's out right now for Electoral Area C. I don't know the numbers that have been received to date, but it's, I think, around 300 survey responses from Electoral Area C. So yes, very well received so far. We're hoping that those survey results will help inform the director's consideration of whether or not to opt in to the principal residence regulation that's currently being contemplated and that we need to do prior to March 31st of this year. I do believe, though, to date, with the number of survey results we have, it does appear to be quite split down the middle from the residents' perspective as to whether or not they would like to opt in to the principal residence option. So again, I'm not sure how to move forward, but I think it would take quite a bit of time to read through these questions and answers here at EASC today.
How about maybe just a suggestion here? if you have them printed out, if we circulate them, I wonder if the chair or the committee wants to amend the agenda, put it at the end if we go through our regular committee meeting, and then you want to go through the questions as time permits at the end? I don't know, just an idea, unless, or we can do it now, whatever the.
Director Vinesh wants to say
Okay.
something. Director Vinesh has his hand up.
Do you want to amend
Michael, would you
the
be able to
agenda?
email those to me?
Oh,
Yeah,
Director Vaness?
yeah, we can. We'll,
I have a
can
question.
can
I
you
can,
get, yeah, we'll get somebody to scan it and email it to you here in a second.
Director Vaness has got his hand up there.
He just asked if he could have it emailed to me.
Oh, okay. So did we have a motion to amend the agenda? We'll deal with this at the end of the meeting.
I see that Director Rice has his mic on. Maybe he
Yeah.
has a question before I
Okay.
have one.
I just, I'll take a look at the questions that have already been provided, but I do have some other ones. And one question that I have that is quite critical to the primary residents is that, and I'm quite certain that this is quite accurate, is that if the whole house is being rented and it changes use, that actually triggers a GST implication. And that GST implication would actually be on the assessed value of the house. So basically what I'm trying to say is that if you've got a primary resident that is being used as a short-term rental, and they have to then convert the use on it, on their taxes, they're going to get hit with a GST bill. That GST bill will be based on the assessed value of the house. That can be quite devastating for some homeowners and some property owners. So again, I'll send the list of questions that I have in, and we can take a look, but that's what I wanted to just let everybody know on that.
Well, thank you. That's significant. So if we want to deal with this end of the meeting, we should have a motion to amend the agenda.
I would like to make a comment, and then I will make that motion to amend the agenda. And I think from the perspective of many of the residents of Area C, they've been tuning into the meetings and really paying attention to what's happening around this topic. So I think that although it's unfortunate that Ministry of Housing delegation was unable to appear, it would be quite beneficial, I'm sure, for the community to be able to hear what the questions and the answers. So maybe we could take the time to do that at the end.
You bet.
And I would move that we amend the agenda to discuss the short-term rental questions and answers as, I guess, would I move that as an addendum item?
Sure.
Okay.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? That's carried. So the next item on our agenda is adoption of previous minutes from February 4, 2024.
Move adoption.
Second.
Discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, that's carried. Business arising, anything? Public considerations, none. Those motion, chairs report, staff reports, one ESA development permit, DP 4D 23 Fisher.
Move receipt.
Second.
I believe Annika will speak to this.
Thank you, through the chair to the committee. The application before you is for an environmentally sensitive areas development permit in Electoral Area D. It is to allow the property owners to proceed with development of their parcel of land to place a single-family dwelling on the property. They are required to put servicing through to the single-family dwelling, and that servicing will transect a environmentally sensitive area. They've received a RAR report by a professional QUEEP, which outlines requirements for them during the development of their property, as well as a final inspection by the environmental professional. The staff report outlines what those requirements are, as well as the permit itself, which will be registered on title. And prior to final of occupancy, the ESADP requirements will be met. Staff supports issuing the development permit to allow the applicants to proceed with development of their property. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? Director Rice?
Just to add a little bit more to that, in this area of the community, all of the electrical services are underground. So that's what this is required. And that was a stipulation that was put back in the day when this subdivision was built, is that going forward, all new construction would also put all of their electrical works underground. Thank you.
Seeing nothing further, Director Mooney?
Thank you. I had a question for staff about this. I noticed in the report from the professional that provided their opinion, they were talking about the special management area, and maybe I'm getting that term wrong, that there's a 5-meter wide section, and that in 4 meters in length, 4 meters in width and 15 meters in length, there is an incursion into that special environmental area. And so I guess what I'm curious about is how staff manage something like this. If the report is saying that there's been construction of roofs and wooden things and gravel pads installed, I guess what I'm wondering is if we're providing, if we're permitting this power source to be permanently installed, does that somehow indicate that we are providing tacit permission for the work that's already been done in the area that isn't supposed to have any work done in it?
Yeah, thank you. The requirement through staff as part of this development was that any works that were done prior to the issuance of the development permit were to be identified through the report of the QUEEP, and any remediation requirements for that work that was done prior to the issuance of the development permit be required through the development permit process and consultation with the QUEEP and the final report of that QUEEP. So the QUEEP will has outlined requirements and remediation with respect to planting, and the QUEEP will ensure that those are done prior to signing off.
Could you just remind me what QUEEP stands for?
Qualified environmental professional.
Anything further? Seeing none, on receipt, all those in favor? That's unanimous, that's carried. And then the recommendation.
I'd like to move that the committee recommend the environmentally sensitive area development permit DP 4D23 Fisher as attached in the staff report dated February 14th, 2024 be approved, and that the corporate officer be authorized to issue the permit.
Second.
Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? It's carried. None were opposed. Second is Quathiaski Cove Water Study for receipt.
Move receipt.
Second.
I believe Sheena will speak to this.
Thank you. Through the chair to the committee. So this is an update to a study that was originally conducted in 2013, so an initiative that has been on the books of the regional district for quite some time. It is building on a study that was wedged in between the two from Coors Engineering to identify the feasibility of a groundwater supply to support the Quathiaski Cove Village Plan and its proposed densification as identified in that plan. So this was a desktop study, again, just updating the recommendations from Thurber from 2013. A few items that have changed include an increase in the number of wells that they anticipate will need to drill to service the anticipated demand of that densification. And then just an update of the information that is available through the province and the federal government about the groundwater supplies and state of the aquifers in the project area. It also provided an analysis of the cost estimates to conduct further drilling to validate the findings of the report. This is a very technical report, again, based on a desktop study. The findings would need to be ground truth through the drilling, but their tentative or their preliminary recommendation is that there is a moderate probability of finding adequate water, which is a very middle of the road term that does not, in my opinion, provide clear direction as to whether or not we'll be successful or not. So that's why we are bringing this back to the committee to receive further direction. There is money in the budget that was identified or allocated through the Growing Communities Fund that is not quite enough, we anticipate, based on our current estimates. But certainly gets us much closer to having the funds needed to take the next step. So we've provided three options. One is to sort of further validate the budget of the items that were not captured in that original cost estimate, which would be getting a hydrogeologist to determine the most suitable well test locations and then get some quotes from local drillers to figure out what that would cost. Another option is to update the Coors study and the cost estimates to actually build out the final distribution system, noting that that will be a significant capital cost, budgeted at over $10 million in 2021, and that is likely to have escalated as pretty much all of our project costs have escalated considerably over the past few years. Or the other recommendation is that we reallocate that $200,000 through the Growing Communities Fund to other initiatives if the committee does not feel that moderate probability is enough probability to take the next steps. Happy to answer any other questions that anyone might have.
I have a quick question. In that area of Quadra Island, what's the average depth that they drill to find water?
Well, there's quite a variety depending on which aquifer you are drilling in. Luckily, one of these reports has a very handy table for me to read to you. So the average depth of the overburden wells is 126 feet, and the average depth of the bedrock wells is 369 feet. That's 38 and 112 meters respectively.
That's deep.
Yeah, so they are recommending that our wells are up to 100, that we do 3 test wells up to 150 meters deep. So they are recommending that we search in that bedrock aquifer.
Right. Director Mulwiney?
Thank you, Chair. It is a super interesting report and quite dense. One thing I was curious about is the test drilling locations. Would they be on private land or public land, and how does that work? Is there agreements that are come to with the landowners, and then if or when there were test holes that were drilled, do those become wells that then service the water service, or are they just holes that we fill in afterwards? How does that work?
So I don't have firm answers to those. The next step, one of the next steps would be to hire the hydrogeologist to identify those test locations. There are constraints that you mentioned, such as private property or within the road allowance, noting that we don't own a lot of SRD-owned property in there. So we would need to make those considerations when determining the test locations. We would need appropriate permissions from the property owners as well. There are also required offsets from septic fields or sanitary systems that would need to be taken into account when determining those test locations. As for whether or not the wells could become production wells, I would need to confirm that. I believe they could, but that would be contingent on them providing the production or the yield that we need, as well as the water quality that we need. But certainly we would get those answers as part of the next step of hiring the hydrogeologist, and we could bring back more information.
If I can, Mr. Chair, I would anticipate that it would be on private land. We don't own anything ourselves unless it's in a park, and it doesn't seem like these are in a park. Modi has very limited, ability for us, I would say, to put wells on Modi land. So I would anticipate, and it often is, that it's on privately owned land that you would negotiate at some point with the landowner.
So I could just insert a comment here. When these wells are drilled to that depth, they'll put a steel casing down as they go. That will be permanent. So the owner of that property will have that well when it's finished.
Yeah, we would again, if we drilled on there would be some caveats, if successful, if we did this, that, and the other. So they would be part of a negotiation for sure. Yeah.
Director Mulwiney?
And it sounds like from the report that there would possibly need to be 7 wells. That's a fair amount of wells, and I don't know how far apart those would be from each other. So, I mean, I guess it seems complex to have, you can't just have them all side by side, so maybe they wouldn't all be on even the same property. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts. You're likely correct, right? Which complicates things, right? There's no sense having a well 2 feet from another one. And so is that on the same property? Is it on a different property? So yeah, when you don't own land and you're looking for groundwater and you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, all those things can be complicated for sure. So that would be, part of, again, repopulating the report with updated estimates and looking at information like that about locations. And are we talking about one property, two properties? Is there public property? Yeah, it's not simple.
And yeah, to add to that, the CAO is correct. Wells in close proximity to each other have quite a bit of influence over each other. So having two wells in close proximity would probably negate the benefit of having two separate wells. And then it all, again, depends on the yield that we're finding. So it could potentially be over 7 wells if the yield is under our desired threshold. So yeah, adding to the complexity of providing capital costs to this project. Thank you.
Director McWhinney?
Thank you, Chair. I think that I would like to, I think that, in consideration of the options that are here, I think that option A really seems like it's kind of maybe going too quickly, too fast, considering that we're talking about potentially 7 wells and quotes and things like that, and if we're not sure that it's where we want to go. So I think option B, that I would make, once we've done a receipt, I would maybe be interested in moving option B, and I'm curious if staff have any thoughts on anything else that maybe needs to be included in the study and cost estimates, or if you think that will provide a complete picture of the potential cost of the project.
I would certainly want to include getting the drilling costs, or at least an average cost per well as part of that. That was part of what option A was to update, to get those quotes. So I think that would be a relevant factor that the committee would like to consider. But other than that, the course report does cover quite a bit.
Why not say to a potential developer, you drill the wells. If you find water, we'll give you the development permits. If you don't, we won't.
Yeah, if you got one, give us their name. But I think that's part of the intention for sure. This is one of those things where it'd be nice to have a bird in the hand if we knew we had some water. This report questions whether there is even water in these locations, right? So we're trying to explore, do we take that deeper and spend money on it, or do we look at other locations? But I think at the end of the day, you're right. What we'll want to do is trying to have a source and use that as our contribution with some development projects in First Nations or something like that. But we're not sure we have those locations yet, and we're not sure that we want to invest our money in that and then come up with a pair of twos here. So,
All right, anything further? Director Rice?
Just one comment. Area D just had a well done, and price tag on it was over 400,000. So
How deep was that, Director Rice?
I don't really know, but it wasn't a horribly deep one, because there is a good source of water there. But again, I think the price tag on that was around 425 or something
yeah,
like
I
that.
think that was the well in the park.
No, that was the well on Shelter Point Farms.
Oh, okay. Because the well in the park was fairly expensive, and that came up without much water there either, so.
I just dug one a year and a half ago, 280 feet, 30,000. Okay, on receipt. All those in favor? And that's carried. Recommendation, Director Mooney?
I think I would move option B, that the committee recommend that the 2021 Coors study and cost estimates be updated using the information from this report, and specifically the cost of adding up to 7 additional supply wells to the proposed system and incorporating current cost projections. Does that cover what you were suggesting also, Sheena? Thank you.
We need a second then.
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all in favor? No one's opposed, that's carried. Number 3, Area D traffic study update for receipt.
Move receipt.
Second.
Second.
Sheena will speak to this as well.
Thank you. Through the chair to the committee. This is just an update to the committee about the status of an initiative that we started advocating for last year with the Ministry of Transportation. Last year, the committee provided some funding for the SRD to conduct a traffic study. Immediately following that, we started to engage with the ministry to ensure that the methodologies and recommendations that may be arrived from that study could be actionable, seeing as most of them would need to take place within their road allowance. At a meeting that we had with them, they were quite clear that they preferred that we not be the lead on that study and that they would be take charge of that study as well as the funding. We met with them last month to sort of set the parameters in terms of reference for that study based on consultation with the director that happened the year prior. And they've confirmed that it is within their 2024 budget, and we're waiting for certain activities and milestones in April of this year before they could commit to timing of that. The details about what should be included in that study is in the background of the report, but I am happy to provide any additional information or answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you.
Director Rice?
I just wanted to say thank you for the update. I know that probably on a month-to-month basis, I get asked this question, where are we at? Where are we at? So the report was excellent timing on that. I think it also underscores back to the community how difficult it is to get these things done, you know, that there's a lot of work that goes in the background. You know, speaking about budgets, I mean, you know, Modi does their budgets in November, but they don't get a commitment on their budget until April, and then they actually don't get their budget until May, and all of these things have to be factored in. So thank you for the report.
Anything further? On receipt, all those in favor? None opposed, that's carried. Have you got any motions, Director Rice? Okay, moving on. Number 4 is the Heritage Conservation Service for receipt.
Move receipt.
Move it. Second.
Second by Director Banesh. Discussion? Seeing none. Do we have some?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just maybe mention that this may be one of those examples whereby if we had access to the Mirage documents, which were provided by Comox Valley when this regional district was formed, we might be able to glean some information from that. But at this point, there's nothing in our files giving the history of this service.
Thank you, Mr. Yates. Director Mooney?
I have a question for the corporate officer. After reading the Heritage Conservation section of the Local Government Act that was included in this report, I was unable to determine if this Heritage Conservation Service would entirely relate to structures or if it could be considered for natural features such as a significant pocket forest or something.
Mr. Chairman, I think we'd have to look into that and maybe having a bit more specificity around what kinds of things were being considered for heritage conservation would be helpful. I don't have a quick answer to that.
Thank you.
On receipt then, all those in favor? None opposed, that is carried. Number 5, processing of rezoning bylaws for receipt.
Move receipt.
Okay, Director Mooney and Director Rice.
So, Mr. Chair, Annika will speak to this, but what the impetus of this, excuse me, is that there is some new reporting and requirements or lack thereof for public hearings, and it's a little bit confusing. So I thought it would be valuable for the committee for us to do our best to outline that and describe what the new process is. As we've been engaging this, so we've found that there is, when the province implements some new legislation, it's not like they do it in consultation with local government and identifies their timing in terms of meetings and what local newspapers or publications do. And big surprise, they don't always align. And so one of them, we found in Quadra and through our notification was that through the limiting window of times we have through notification, the cutoff date was basically the same as the publication date, which seems quite awkward and kind of foolish to many, as we understand. So we just try to outline in here the process and how we're kind of limited and giving the committee some options should we run into public hearings that are prohibited, what you can do if you feel there's additional public information or consultation that you want, there is, excuse me, options for that. So I don't know if there's anything more for Aniko to add. I might have stole her thunder, but it was trying to kind of outline the requirements, the old process, new process, and what you can do if you feel challenged in terms of public consultation. You know, one more thing I'm going to add here, just as a bit of an editorial in terms of the philosophy with the province in terms of saying no public hearings if it's in line with an OCP. That sounds great. However, there's no requirement for electoral areas to do OCPs on a prescriptive timeline, and therefore you can have OCPs that are quite old. And so that doesn't always align with what their philosophy of skipping the public hearings. And so what we try to, again, provide that you, if you do get into that situation, there still are alternatives.
Can I just throw in a question here after your statement? In the previous application, we had an Area D where initially we turned it down, then afterwards we approved it. The reason that I'd vote against that in the first place was because the OCP said 2 hectares and the developer wanted 1 hectare. But staff said, well, the 2 hectare stipulation in the OCP didn't really matter, didn't really count because it was overridden by something else, and I forget what that was now. But in the final analysis, maybe staff thinks it meets the OCP, maybe we don't. And it comes to the question of public hearing. I mean, who has the final say in this? If we say, no, it doesn't meet the OCP, we could have a public hearing.
I'll let Aniko answer that.
Yeah, thank you.
But sorry, before she does, nothing is stopping you from having a public information meeting.
I realize that, but I'm talking about public hearing.
Yeah, thank you. Through the chair, with respect to the question on consistency with OCPs, an OCP cannot dictate minimum lot sizes. So regardless of how someone interprets an OCP, it cannot be considered inconsistent with a zoning amendment where the zoning amendment is not changing the OCP designation. So that's just aside there. So staff, as the technical experts, use their abilities to determine where OCP amendments are required and where they are not. With respect to the new legislation, we need to be clear, is not for every zoning amendment. And it's not for every zoning amendment that is consistent with the official community plan. There's a very narrow scope with respect to what applications are prohibited from having public hearings.
Yeah, just to be clear though, Aniko, if the board feels that it doesn't meet the OCP, is that legally to say, okay, therefore we will have a public hearing, even though staff may not agree?
The board is the decision maker.
Yeah.
So with respect to these applications that are in line with the official community plan, they are specific to those applications that are for housing and where the overall housing is being developed is more than 50% of whatever is being developed on the property. So again, this is a very narrow scope as to where this legislation applies. The province has said time and time again that this is not an opportunity to relitigate these sorts of applications. The OCP, where support is made, is likely not going to change that level of support when it's reviewed. It's highly unlikely that when we go through an OCP review process, we are going to be less favorable for housing, especially now with the requirements that were legislated through the province for identifying the housing needs over a 25-year term. So if anything, a review of your OCP would likely, I mean, I'm sure there's an instance where it wouldn't, but overall would likely provide additional support for the zoning application. So the zoning application is in line with the official community plan. The ask of the rezoning application is typically to reduce the lot size by some percentage, where it is still overall within that category of a designation, so a rural designation or a country residential designation. To go back to the legislative changes, again, specific to these types of applications only, And the notification process has only changed to the extent of when the formal notice is provided. So the timing for notification has not changed. The legislation has not changed with respect to the length of time that's required or that is limited to. So prior to the new legislation and now, we are still narrowed by having to provide notification not more than 10 or less than 3 days from the time that the proposal is being considered. So whether it's prior to this legislation and we're talking about prior to public hearing, or subsequent to this legislation where we're talking about prior to first reading, the timing that we are required to adhere to has not changed at all. The only change in the instance of a prohibited public hearing is that your notice happens before the board gives first and second reading, not before public hearing. And that's because the board has the ability to provide all 4 readings and approve a bylaw at that first meeting where the application is being considered for first reading and potentially adoption. Our notification process, again, hasn't changed. As soon as the application has been given recommendation for first and second reading, notice goes out to the public that day with respect to mail-outs and on our SRD website. We then are legislated to have our notice in the newspaper, again, not more than 10 or less than 3 days away from the public hearing. And where we can, we provide additional notification through other forms of correspondence, such as your bird's eye or your currents or your tideline, those sorts of things. And those are sometimes the instances where that ad might not come as quickly as you'd wanted, but you either don't put the ad in at all or you put it in and provide that additional notification opportunities to the public prior to when the notices are required to be closed and before any correspondence is attached to the board agenda. Through our legal consultation, we've got confirmation that comments from the public are to be received prior to first reading and that they are to be appended to the staff report when the agenda is published. So that means that notification processes will close the Friday before the meeting and any correspondence appended to the agenda so that the directors have the opportunity to review those comments prior to giving first and second reading the following Wednesday. I think that's probably as much as I can provide you at this time.
Thank you, Aniko. Anything further, Director Mooney?
Thank you, Aniko and staff, for this report. Just to your point of suggesting that we can only receive correspondence prior to production of the agenda on first reading, before we consider first reading. I noticed in the report, in 2 different places, it sort of has maybe like mildly conflicting language, because it says on page 3, something about limiting the ability of the board to receive public input following first reading. And then in paragraph 2 on page 2, it says, it is important to note that the board may consider public feedback up to the time of bylaw adoption. So, but you're saying again that we have to only receive information from the time of an ad being published to the date of the agenda, which is, in my understanding, 2 days of public well, if an ad is going in the paper on a Wednesday, if it goes there, that's when the Camera Vermeer is published, right? Am I getting that wrong? Meredith's shaking her head.
Just continue.
Okay. Well, it seems to me that right now, with this new process, it would go from being considered here at the Electoral Area Services Committee to potentially adopting the change all in 14 days. So if we're at a Wednesday Electoral Area Services Committee meeting and we recommend to the board that they consider first reading, then you're going to send out an ad, which is going to be published the following Wednesday. And that has a cutoff date of Friday, because that's when the agenda is produced. So there's 48 hours from the time of somebody seeing an ad until they're able to provide you with a written correspondence. Am I getting that right?
That's correct through that medium. Of course, there's mailouts and our website, but yeah, through that, there is, that would, under that scenario, the newspaper publication would be practically the 2 days, yeah.
Could we
Which is
defer
lo-
first and second?
Which is legislated. We are not, the newspaper requirement is legislated to not come out more than 10 or less than 3 days prior to the board giving consideration of first and second reading or conducting a public hearing. So that one method of notification is very prescribed. You are absolutely correct. As indicated in the report, we provide public notification the Wednesday of Eask, which is 14 days prior. It goes up on our website, goes out on social media, mailouts are provided, and any other forms of notification that we're able to insert and add in are done that Wednesday.
So I'm just going to add here one thing to, an option for that is, let's say there was an application that came forward and you thought there was, or anticipated there was going to be some community feedback. The EASC recommendation could also have the caveat of which board meeting it's going to go to. We inherently would bring it to the next one. And that would, like you say, we put it in the paper and then you got 2 days. You could legally say, we make this recommendation and that it come to XYZ board meeting. That all of a sudden creates a larger window. Well,
Not for the newspaper
not notification, but the committee has seen it. The window is open. Now, the publication is still tighter, but I guess the run-up to it, there's been a lot more runway to that publication, if you will.
What if we deferred it at East? Would that increase the
You
notification?
could defer as well.
Would the notification go out on the first meeting?
No,
when we deferred?
notification wouldn't change. So what would happen is, so let's say in this scenario, an application came today and you made it for the April board meeting. Planning would still do the same notification in April. They would work back from the board, that 10 days work from the back. But from today to, I don't know, let's say April 15th or something, there's this runway that's out there that people are aware of it. So that is one, deferring is another. So try to just, there are challenges at sometimes, and there are going to be some that are fine and some that you may want to find ways around. And we just try to outline that if you do find yourself in a position where you think there should be, I don't want to say public notification because that hasn't changed, but maybe more runway of awareness, then you could make it another board meeting.
Mr. Yates has a comment here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So to Director Mawhinney's question, I think it's important not to conflate the requirements for public notification, which Onoco has stated very succinctly and correctly, with the public response to that. And I think that's why the board can consider, up until the time the bylaw is adopted, they can consider any feedback. This is not a public hearing process. It's an information thing. So we advise the public of the board's intent to consider first reading on a certain date. It may or may not be that all of the comments come in prior to that date. All I'm saying in response is that there's nothing illegal about the board considering any feedback that it receives up until the point of adoption, at which point it's all moved.
May I have a follow-up on that? Because that's great, but I think in the last ads that went out, they had a deadline of noon on the Friday in order for that public feedback to be included on the agenda. So I'm wondering if there's another, process or method, so then, because this part of this report does state that the board may consider public feedback up to the time of bylaw adoption. But if we're providing in our public notice, if we're saying that there is a cutoff date and it's 5 days before the board is considering the amendment, then it is maybe giving the wrong impression to the community members that they've already missed a deadline for including their feedback. So do we have a process for sending or sharing to all the directors any additional feedback that isn't necessarily included on an agenda because of the tight timeline? And maybe, I guess, the question that might relate to one of the other questions that I had is because one of the recommended motions offers to provide alternatives for public input, but I didn't necessarily see what those suggestions were. So maybe these are related questions.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what the report is trying to say is that we cannot prevent people from providing comments to the board up until the time that they consider final adoption. That's what the report means. It doesn't mean that we are not obligated to provide a cutoff for people so that their correspondence can form part of the public agenda to be considered by both the directors and be seen by the rest of the community prior to first reading, because at first reading, you could potentially be adopting the bylaw. So you don't want to make people think that potentially they have the opportunity to submit their written comments after the date in the newspaper in case the bylaw is adopted at first reading. So this is from legal counsel, how we are prescribed to put notification out. Again, that doesn't prevent you from having someone email you, telephone you, stop you in the news or in the grocery store to give you their input. You can still receive public input yourself up until the time that you give final adoption. It's not the same as a public hearing where you're told, don't talk to anybody about it after public hearing. So yes, in fact, there are other means of the board or individual directors obtaining information prior to final adoption.
Director Vinesh?
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if we could just solve this issue by just introducing a policy where we have third reading happen in the next meeting, and then we don't do all the readings in one meeting, and just slow the process down a little bit, gives a little bit more input. Maybe there are applications that we do need to do a bit faster, but I think for most applications, if we slowed it down by a couple of weeks or a month, it's not going to have a huge impact, and it does legitimately give people more chance to provide input, which I think is just really important for us in our work.
I'm not sure about a policy, because then that would be a one size fits all, because there's some of them that would be in line with the OCP and there's no reason for it. So there's options available, and in the alternatives, we would never amend a bylaw without bringing those suggestions to you and showing you what they could be. So included in here, we have a couple options for you, and we can bring suggestions, recommendations for including in that bylaw that provide you with options.
I suppose we could always move a recommendation for first and second only, and then next month do third and final.
You
that's it.
you could, but again, what Annika is saying to you is then that kind of, the notification doesn't shrink, it stays the same, but the runway for it could be. So I think one of the things to remember would be to look at the particular application, look at the dates of our committee and our board meeting, and if you think there needs to be more runway, either defer and or make a specific date that the board, you have that meeting, if you think it's an issue.
Right, okay.
If I
Any
may,
further?
I think one thing that we're also maybe not considering here is that, at least for electoral areas C and D, these applications would also firstly go to an advisory planning commission. So this will become public knowledge and have input from your APC and potentially neighbors prior to the application even coming to your electoral area services committee. So there is much more time available for people to be aware that this application is going to be considered prior to it even coming forward to the electoral area services committee. The other thing I must say, only because it's been pounded into our heads at every webinar and legal session that we've had, is that the intent of this legislation is so that where there is an appetite, certainly, that we expedite these processes to allow for housing and, provide for additional housing and housing opportunities. So to slow down the process, as we've been told, or to come up with other means of holding what is more or less a public hearing really goes against the intent of this legislation. So I do think that there are certainly potentially some considerations depending on what the application is. But I mean, for the most part, what we're seeing here in electoral areas D and C is that these applications are more or less for 2-lot splits where you're subdividing a property or allowing for the subdivision of a property into 2 and potentially increasing the density by an additional 2. You're likely not going to see applications like this because of how your OCPs are written that would be considering large scale development opportunities or multifamily or mixed use, just because your OCP doesn't support that. So just wanted to provide that little bit of clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Aniko. Director Rice.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to say thank you, Aniko, for mentioning the advisory panel committees. That gives the directors an opportunity to hear from them first. The other thing that I wanted to say is that I welcome this new legislation. I think it's time that we actually start expediting development applications a little bit better than we currently do. I think that, from a director's perspective, we have to take a look at the report. We have to evaluate and recognize that we're getting, information from the planning department. They have the technical expertise. I mean, I don't really see why we need to start slowing down processes when we should be speeding them up. So that's just my thoughts. I welcome this new legislation. I understand that, the notification is quite the thing, but I'm also wondering if you can put out, after the notification, if we could put out a reminder to let people know that, we still have up to third reading to take input. So I'm wondering if we can do a follow-up, and maybe that's something that we can take a look at.
Anything further? Director Mooney?
Thank you, Chair. I have a question, and that was that there are 2 options for recommendations in this report, and they both reference bylaw number 5, the planning fees and procedures bylaw. And I must say I was surprised that the report would reference that bylaw, but not include the bylaw. Because we don't have, as directors, we don't have access to that bylaw other than if it was to be included. So if there were to be motions that are being brought back, we're going to be bringing back a report or further updates to this bylaw, I would really like to have, personally, I would have liked to have seen the bylaw first. And I guess as a second best would be if you're bringing back options, it would be nice if they were redlined so that we could really be clear on what the differences are.
Okey dokey. Anybody else? Seeing none, on receipt. All those in favor? And that is unanimous. That's carried. Is there anything further on that? Number 6, capital funding for Kitts Island halls for receipt.
Hang on, is anybody making a motion for number 5?
Nobody has. Did someone want to?
I would move
Yeah,
option B.
okay,
Go ahead, Mark.
Director Van Ash?
I would move option B, but I'd like to defer it until we can actually see the bylaw number 5 that the motion's referring to. I think that's important for the public and for directors to see before making a decision. So can we?
Okay. B, do we have a seconder?
To defer this.
Second.
Okay. Any discussion? Anything else, Director Van Ash, on your motion? No? Anybody else?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, call a question. All those in favor? Option B. Opposed? None opposed. That's carried. Okay, number 6, capital funding for Kitts Island halls for receipt.
Move receipt.
Second.
Director Van Ness and Director Winnie, any discussion? Seeing none, on receipt, all those in favor? That's unanimous, carried. Number 7,
Hang on.
motion?
Yeah, there is a motion. I'm not sure if staff are going to speak to it first.
No, nothing to add.
Okay, so
Just
yeah,
before you make your motion, Director Vanessa, just let me remind you, during receipt, if you're going to make a follow-up motion, let me know, and then I won't skip by you. Go ahead.
Will do, thanks. I just want to thank staff for putting this together. I think it's really clear in the bylaw amendment that this opens up the possibility to fund our community halls through funds other than tax requisition, which I think is the will of Cortez, and certainly the intent of the hall service when it was first created, that it was only going to be used for operating costs. So I would like to move option A, that an amendment by law to allow capital funds to be used for Cortez Island community halls be prepared for further consideration by the board based on the March 6, 2024 report from the CAO.
Second.
Okay, option A is on the table. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor? And opposed? None, that's carried. Okay. Number 7, Electoral Area D stormwater management options for receipt.
Move receipt.
Second.
Discussion, anyone?
Staff don't have much to add here.
Okay. Director Rice?
I just wanted to say that when we get to the options, I will be moving an option there. So
Okay.
thank you.
On receipt then, all those in favor? Yes, you may, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. In this report, it highlighted that there are a number of existing flood issues, and there's a complex natural environment in the southern half of Electoral D, and that there's a recommendation in that report that the regional district should draft and approve a bylaw to make Area D a designated development permit area to ensure that flooding issues are properly considered. I was just curious if that happened, if Area D is a DP area, and I'm curious if that happens through the OCP or if it happens through some other process.
Thank you through the chair. I'm not exactly sure what form of DP other than a flood DP is referenced in that staff report. So I'd have to look back for more clarity. In absence of a service, difficult for us to enforce a development permit specific for flooding. We do have hazard land DPs that were adopted as part of the most recent official community plan, which may or may not encompass portions of what was referenced in this staff report with respect to flood. So yeah, I can't clearly state that there's a blanket flood development permit for electoral area D.
Thank you. Anything further? Director Mooney?
I was curious if this was referencing a stormwater report for Area D. Has there ever been one done for Quadra Island or Area C?
Not that I know of, no.
All right. On receipt, all those in favor? It's unanimous, that's carried. Director Rice?
I'd like to move option B, that the committee recommend that the regional district undertake a feasibility study to investigate the potential of establishing a stormwater management service for electoral area D.
Second.
Discussion, anyone? Seeing none, all in favor? None opposed, that's carried. Number 8, compensated immunities for electoral area directors for receipt.
Move receipt.
Seconder, please.
Second.
Director Vanessa.
So if I may, Mr. Chair, so this, when we established the commensable meetings several years ago, I think the intent that the list of meetings would likely grow depending on what's offered out there and what directors are attending. We have a new group of directors this term. There's a learning curve out there. There's a knowledge base that they're pursuing. And therefore, there's other forums and conventions that they're attending. So far, I mean, it doesn't mean it's exhaustive or it's completely inclusive, and it can continue to grow and expand. But what we've done here is provide a list of the forums and conferences that we know are available and that directors have attended. And if we want to add that to the list of commensable meetings, we can certainly do that.
Anything else? Director Mooney.
Thank you, Chair. I had a question for probably the CAO or the CFO. I believe that compensation for attendance and registration fees for directors are paid from the electoral area administration silo. The conference costs associated with the SRD chair and CIO attending conferences and representing the SRD, which function receives these costs?
General admin.
Okay, thanks. I couldn't see it in my finance book.
With the theory behind that is everything that I do is for everyone, yeah.
All right, just my only comment on this is when we get to the motion, I'd like to see something that's not just a blanket amount, because I wouldn't want to get paid for stuff that I have no intention of attending. So it'd be just better to expand the list.
Yeah, so again, Mr. Chair, if you want to populate option A with
Yeah.
the list we got here, that's kind of
My
the intent
preference
of it.
anyway. Okay, on receipt. All those in favor? That's carried unanimous. And a motion, please.
I would move option A, that the committee recommend that the current list of compensable meetings be expanded to include the following meetings for electoral area directors. And do you want me to read them all?
Yes.
I think I just do the whole list. The Electoral Area Directors Forum, the LGLA Leadership Academy Conference, the BC Broadband Conference, Keeping It Rural Conference, Vancouver Island Economic Alliance, Island Health Conference, and the Island Health Climate Gathering.
Anyone else? No, I just have a question for staff. I know we pay mileage and hotels and all that, and meeting pay. What about travel time? Do we pay that as well?
There's travel time, but I don't know, is it, I don't know if it's honestly ever been claimed for conferences. Off the top of my head, I'm going to say travel time is,
Just curious.
I think it's rarely claimed
Yeah.
to conferences and stuff like, the intent is travel time to come here.
Yeah, just curious.
Yeah.
Okay,
We don't have a seconder on the motion. We don't have a seconder on the.
I seconded it.
thank you. Need a seconder on Director Mooney's motion.
I'll second it.
Director Vanessa, are you seconding that?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. All right, we'll
Yeah,
call the
I'll
question
second
then. All those in favor? Anyone opposed? One opposed. Director Race is opposed. That's carried.
Can we ask, I'm just curious why you're opposed. Can you state your feelings?
Certainly. I think what we already get paid as directors is quite high in the province. And I'm happy, as part of my job, to attend meetings. I don't feel that I need to get paid for them. When I go off to conferences, I get paid for mileage. I don't feel that I need to get paid to be at the conference. So I'm quite happy with the way things are as they are right now. Thank
How about
you.
accommodation, Director Race?
Accommodations are already paid for. So what I'm saying is I don't think that I need to get paid for meetings. That's part of my job description.
I understand, but question staff, are we paid for accommodations if they're not listed in the bylaw,
We always pay for accommodations, yeah.
regardless?
Yeah. yeah.
Okay. All righty, thank you for that, Director Race. All right, number 9, request for financial assistance, Stewart Island Community Association for receipt.
Move receipt.
Seconder,
Second.
discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of receipt? That's carried. Anyone opposed, by the way? No, it's carried. And the recommendation.
I would like to move that the committee recommend that a grant and aid for the Stewart Island Community Association in the amount of $1,500 be approved to assist with costs associated with liability insurance to be paid from the Electoral Area C grant and aid budget.
Seconder, please.
Second it.
Mr. Vinesh seconded that. All those in favor? That's unanimous, that's carried. Number 10, request for economic development funding, Quadra Island Chamber Music Society for receipt.
Move receipt.
Come on, seconders.
Second.
Thank you. Discussion? All those in favor? Anyone opposed? That's carried. And a recommendation.
I will move that the committee recommend that the board approve an economic development grant for the Quadra Island Chamber Music Society in the amount of $1,500 to assist with costs associated with the 2024 concert series to be paid from the Electoral Area C Economic Development Service budget.
I'll second it.
Thank you. Dr. Vinesh seconded it. All those in favor? That's unanimous and carried. Bylaws correspondence, Mountaineer Rescue Society, financial assistance request. for receipt.
Move receipt.
This is the February 12, 2024 correspondence.
Second.
Second by Director Rice. Want to do them both? You okay with that, Director Rice?
Yep.
All right, on both those motions of receipt, anybody got anything to say? Call a question, all in favor? That's carried. Director Maloney?
Thank you, Chair. I did have a question, and I'm not sure if anybody would have the answer, but the February 12th letter indicated that a request was sent to Chair Mark Baker. I'm not sure if anyone can confirm whether that letter was received or if we are considering a grant and aid request to the board for a regional grant and aid for this organization.
Is this the Mars one?
Yeah.
Yeah, so if it came to the chair, it's on here. So whether Director Baker saw it or not, we would put it on as correspondence. So people will send correspondence to the chair. We'll infer that as to the committee or board. And so whether he got it or not, you got it.
I
But will it be
believe,
on the board agenda?
I believe the correspondence on today's agenda is different.
Oh,
than
is it?
the
Oh, okay.
Yes, I do believe so.
Okay.
Okay.
They sent something to the board as well? Oh,
Okay, not on the board agenda.
It just mentions it in the correspondence that they sent something to the chair. That's why I was asking.
Anything further on receipt?
Yes, I did have something further because I looked through the financial statements that were attached and one thing stood out to me. And that sounds like this organization has committed to a 40-year lease with the Comox Valley Regional District, and they are being provided with $19,200 per year for the next 4 years. And I would like to recommend that this committee recommend to the board to consider a regional grant and aid for this organization.
You can make that motion after receipt.
Yeah.
Anything else in receipt? Call a question, all in favor of receipt? And that's carried, no one's opposed. And your motion, Director Mooney.
Thank you, Chair. I move that this committee recommend the board consider a regional grant and aid for the Mountainair Avian Rescue Society to support residents of the Strathcona Regional District in accessing support for injured, orphaned, or ill wildlife and public education about preventing human-caused animal conflicts.
Would you put an amount in there?
Well, their request is for $12,000, but I thought rather than suggest that to the board, I thought maybe the board could discuss it, but if you think we should put an amount in there, I'm fine with
That'd be
that.
my suggestion because this didn't go to the board, the report, so they won't know their request. So I would stick it in there. They can change it if they wanted, board. Or do it
I'd be
tomorrow.
curious from this committee if anybody has thoughts on an amount that they felt would be appropriate.
It's up to you.
I think it's worth recommending what they've asked for, and then we can discuss that at the board. Director Mindy?
Okay, then we will add the $12,000 into the motion. Do I need to say it again with the number? No? Need to
All righty, we have a
got it.
seconder in that motion?
Second.
Director Race has seconded. All those in favor? That's carried. Number 2, Sayward School Parent Advisory Council for receipt.
move receipt.
Second.
Second.
Discussion? All in favor?
I have a follow-up, Chair.
Oh, but just before we do, thank you, Director Mawini. I just had a little question for staff here. Grant and aid policy in the report said forward the application form supporting documentation to the attention of the appropriate electoral area director of the regional district. I didn't get a copy of this. I wonder if that's just an oversight or is that how we're doing it these days?
normally they send it to the
Yeah,
director and
normally
the
they do.
director
That's what I
sends
thought.
it to us. So that's kind of odd that they
Yeah,
just
it went
send
straight
us.
to East and I never got a copy of it, so I was just a little surprised.
So, Mr. Chair, we do forward any correspondence that is directed to a particular director to that director. In this case, I don't believe a director's name was mentioned. So
Oh.
it just comes as correspondence, and you can do with that as
Okay.
you will.
Good enough. Okay, so on receipt then, all those in favor? And that's carried, none's opposed, and Director Mawini.
Thank you, Chair. I move that we recommend an $800 grant and aid for the Sayward School Parent Advisory Council for the 2024 Bicycle Rodeo to be paid by the Area A Grant and Aid Service.
Second.
Thank you, Director Rice. All those in favor? And that's none opposed, that's carried. All right, Director's reports, open burning regulations. Director Rice.
Thank you, Chair. This came about, as always, every year. One of the things that we see happening in Area D is that the minute we have a really nice day, after weeks of rainfall, somebody has to go out and start burning wet yard stuff, and it just smokes out the neighborhood, and this has been an ongoing problem for some time. So what I did was I actually went back and took a look at some of the existing burning bylaws that are on Vancouver Island, and there are some really good examples, and I think that, we recognize that, of course, we're rural in Area D. We don't want to ban, cooking fires and backyard bonfires, but certainly it might be time to take a look at being able to regulate the big smoky fires that force everybody into their homes, for the rest of the day. And I think that it would be appropriate. So I'm hoping that staff can come back with a report. I did provide them with a document of some of the existing open burning bylaws that are on Vancouver Island. And I think what would be most appropriate for Area D is to perhaps maybe have a window and say, we're going to allow burning between such and such a date and such a date. And I think that that would perhaps maybe curtail the very first day that is half decent, where people go out and just smoke the neighborhood, so.
Would you like to make a motion for a report from staff?
Yep, so I'd like to get a report from staff on what a potential bylaw could take a look at. Thank you.
I can second that, and then I have a comment.
Did you have a question?
Just wanted to add burning bylaw.
Burning bylaw. Right. And Director Mooney?
Thank you, Chair. On Quadra, the Quadra Island Fire Department has their burning regulations, and one of the things that they recommend or insist on is that backyard burning happens only when the venting index is appropriate. And so I think including the venting index in your burning bylaw might be helpful.
Nothing further? All those in favor? And none opposed, that is carried. No new business, addendum items we do have. So, do we have something we can put on the floor here, or is that necessary?
Well, I'm gonna give it to Aniko, and I don't know, we can go through all the questions until the committee is exhausted or we're finished, whatever it was.
Thank you through the chair. I think we may have the questions available as well to post up on the screen, which might be helpful for those watching. So thank you again through the chair. Like I said earlier, there has been to date 12 questions posed to the ministry. Answers to those were provided yesterday afternoon at about 3 o'clock, I believe. So here they are. The first question that we had was, does the strata proper short-term, oh my goodness, we're already off to a good start. Short-Term Rental Accommodation Act apply to short-term workforce housing, camp housing, student housing, or other short-term uses that are more residential in nature, such as the locum home that provides residences to healthcare workers. The answer to that is that in the Act, the STR is defined as accommodation in the property of a property host in exchange for a fee that is provided to members of the public for a period of time of less than 90 consecutive days. This means that the Act does not apply to STR, short-term rental, accommodations that are not open to the broader public, such as dedicated workforce housing or camp housing or accommodations available exclusively to guests registered as healthcare professionals. It also excludes student housing, First Nation communities, hotels and motels, vehicles, tents, or other temporary shelters, such as RVs, strata-titled hotels or motels, properties where there's owners that have fractional interests, timeshare properties, home exchanges, lodges used for outdoor recreational purposes, strata corporation guest suites, where strata corporation sometimes has a guest suite that people that are related to those that own can share and visit, or STRs on farms. And I do believe that this is with respect to the ALR, but I will confirm that I do recall I think in one of our webinars that they mentioned the agricultural land reserve, but we will seek clarity on whether or not it has to be an ALR farm.
Can I just ask you a question there, Aniko? When you say farms, does this have to be farm status or just I'm a farmer?
Exactly, and that's what I'm speaking to here. And we're going to seek further clarity on that. I believe it's agricultural land reserve. I don't recall there being a reference to farm status.
Yeah, because
but
there's lots of people on agricultural land reserve, all the Seward Valley, that aren't farmers, but
yes, for sure.
so they're exempt.
We will seek further clarity on that. Yeah, good point. Thank you so much. Does anyone want to discuss question 1? All right.
Area is not a part of this anyway.
Question 2?
Actually, I have one question. When it talks about workforce housing, one of the concerns that's come up on Cortez is ferry workers. I assume that would fall into the same category as workforce.
I believe it would, yes.
Interpret that way?
I believe it would, yes, thank you. Also, of note here again is the 90 consecutive days as well. So there are many arrangements that we've heard of where somebody's unclear as to whether or not the short-term rental regulations would apply, but they're renting for longer than that 90-day consecutive period. So always remember that 90 days as well.
I have a follow-up on that, and that is, we're talking about ferry workers, and what about ambulance workers? I've heard on Quadra that there's some ambulance personnel who come from away and stay on Quadra for short periods of time while they're working in the ambulance station. Would they be considered workforce housing?
Thank you through the chair. I would assume that yes, they would be considered workforce housing. Again, we could ask for further clarity, but one point is of interest in that, again, some of these arrangements are not open to the broader public anyway. So if it's not open to the broader public, then this regulation doesn't apply. Question 2. So we understand that the principal residence regulations will limit the short-term rental accommodation service being provided in one or both of the following: in the property host's principal residence, and not in more than one secondary suite or other accessory dwelling unit that is in a prescribed location to the property host's principal residence. Regarding the suite, the Act defines a secondary suite as an accessory dwelling unit that is located in and forms part of a primary dwelling unit. We'd asked, does this regulation limit the principal resident host from dwelling in the smaller suite portion of the main home and renting out the larger part as long as the host is residing in the home? The answer to the question was the Act and regulations do not limit a host from living in a smaller secondary suite as their principal residence and utilizing the primary dwelling unit or the larger part of the home as a short-term rental. Any questions? Thank you. Question 3, with the principal residence regulation, could owners who live in the smaller accessory dwelling unit, or ADU, on the property and provide a short-term rental in the larger home be penalized or delisted? The answer to the question was the Act and regulations do not limit a host from living in an accessory dwelling unit on the property as their principal residence and then renting out the primary dwelling unit or the larger home as a short-term rental. So as the principal resident, you could live in either. Any questions? Question 4, if there's a long-term tenant in place on the property and the tenant is providing services such as guest welcoming and or cleaning, could this long-term tenant be considered the host? The Act defines a property host as a person who is legally entitled to possession of a property where short-term rental accommodation services are provided and who has responsibility for arranging the short-term rental offer. By this definition, it appears that guest welcoming and or cleaning may not meet the requirement unless the tenant is also the host, registering and arranging for the short-term rental offer. And this is broken up into two answers because that also relates to question 5. So The first part of the answer is that the Act and regulations do not limit tenants from being property hosts on the property where they are renting. What it does say is way down in question 5, we'll get to that in a minute, solely cleaning or welcoming guests would differ from arranging for the short-term rental offer or listing and would not likely meet the definition of a property host. So back to the second part of the question, if someone owns the property with 2 homes on it and has a long-term renter in one of the homes, and the process for having that renter be registered as the host, or what is the process of having the host registered as a short-term rental, and is that done through the provincial government registry? So the question has multiple answers to it. This one's a bit confusing. So it says that we recognize that there are arrangements where someone other than the property owner may be operating a unit as a short-term rental. For an example, there are circumstances where a tenant with a long-term lease for a unit can offer their unit as a short-term rental. In this situation, the tenant could be the property host under the Act, as they are legally entitled to possession of the property and they have the responsibility for arranging for the short-term rental offer. So they would meet the requirement of the definition of a property host. And it goes on to say there are also circumstances where someone other than the owner, such as an individual or corporation, manages a short-term rental on behalf of the owner. The Act includes the definition of a supplier host, which includes property host as well as a person who, acting on behalf of, under the direction of, or an agent of the property host, has responsibility for arranging for the short-term rental offer, which may include managing the short-term rental accommodation services. Both property and supplier hosts under the Act are the persons responsible for arranging the short-term rental listing. Again, if you are just someone that lives on the property and is cleaning and welcoming guests, that does not meet the definition of a property host or a supplier host. With respect to the question on how the registry will operate, at this point, they say that there's a registration process and that there's more details coming with respect to how that registry will work in the near future, but we've not been provided any details at this time. And that the registry will be established late in 2024. I'm assuming there might be questions on this answer. Again, if there are questions, we can try to seek further clarity from the ministry.
I'm just a little curious about the supplier host. Maybe you can explain that to me a little more?
There might be some further clarity in the actual Act itself, but I think that the definition is more or less the same. So supplier host is the property host and or the following persons where applicable. So a person acting on behalf or under the direction of or as an agent of the property host has the responsibility for arranging for the short-term rental offer and may include managing the short-term rental accommodation services or a prescribed person. So I believe that there will likely be a process to provide this information to the registry. And I think there was some references to a declaration, I think, at some point. So the registry would determine whether or not that person met the definition of either a property host or a supplier host. But from my understanding, the supplier host is someone unique to the property. That's how I understand it.
A supplier host would not be able to be the host, right? Because they don't live on the property.
If they did, they could.
If they did, yes. If they did live on the property, yes. But only if they do live on the property.
If you opt in.
In the opt-in scenario, yes.
So I guess this sort of circles back to the question of if you're a long-term tenant or if there is a long-term rental.
That's clear. That is very, very clear that the short-term rental would meet the requirements if the long-term tenant was met the definition of the property host was managing for the short-term rental. But they couldn't just be someone that lived there and greeted and cleaned rooms.
But if they were taking more of a supplier host role, where they were updating websites and things like that, it sounds like would be potentially, they would be considered a supplier host at that point, if they were taking more of an active role in the job?
It's my understanding, as long as they're the person responsible for arranging the STR listing.
Yeah, okay, so I think that's clear. Basically, if people if they have a long-term renter on their land, that long-term renter can act as a host for the short-term rental as long as that's how it's registered when the province announces the registry.
I think from our understanding, and again, we can try to ask this question in a different way perhaps, but a long-term tenant that arranges for in some way, shape or form or manages the short-term rental for whoever the owner of the property is meets the definition of a property host. The supplier host seems a little bit different to us in that it could potentially be someone who is not a long-term tenant. We will seek further clarity.
Yeah, I assume a lot of this will be clarified once the registry is released, and the host will have to fill that out.
Okay. Question 6. SRD staff have indicated opting in provides support with compliance and enforcement. It is our understanding that after November, when the primary residence regulation comes into effect, data on short-term rental operators will be provided by the province to the SRD. If upon inspection of this data, it is determined that an STR operator does not meet local zoning, the SRD would notify the province and these properties would be flagged for delisting. Can you confirm this or explain the provincial perspective on properties operating outside the bounds of local zoning? The answer was, to clarify, as different elements of the Act come into force, local governments will continue to be responsible for enforcing their own bylaws, while the Provincial Compliance and Enforcement Unit will be responsible for enforcing the Provincial Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act. This includes the new principal residence requirement in applicable communities, as well as requirements to display valid business licenses. Effective May 1st, under the new provincial rules, hosts will be required to display a valid business license number on their listing in areas where a business license is required by the local government. The province is developing a data sharing system, or STR data portal, to support implementation of the overall Act, including enforcement requirements to post business licenses. Local governments with a business license requirement who wish to use the short-term rental data portal will be required to sign an information sharing agreement with the province to onboard the system. In circumstances where an STR listing has not included a valid business license number on a short-term rental listing, there will be a process in place through the data sharing system for local governments to initiate delisting requests to STR platforms to have the listing removed. Note that requirements to display business license numbers apply in both communities where the principal residence requirement applies and communities exempt from the principal residence requirement. What I feel is missing a little bit from this answer is with respect to what happens when the short-term rental listing does not comply with local zoning. It doesn't really speak to that. I mean, it does say that they're assuming that the local governments will be responsible for enforcing their own zoning regulations, but from the information that staff has been provided through our previous consultations with the ministry and legal counsel is that those STR platforms where they are non-compliant with zoning would also potentially be delisted. So further clarity is required on that. But it appears that at this point, the ministry is saying that most of their compliance and enforcement will be focused on the overall requirements of the act itself and the principal residence requirement where that's applicable. So for those communities that are not exempt or for those communities that opt in.
Director Vanessa?
Can I ask a question? Thank you. Question for staff around, Cortez is going through a zoning bylaw review process. The surveys, the SRD survey and certainly the Cortez Housing Society's survey show that, people do want Airbnbs in all areas, and we're going through the zoning bylaw review process. Is it safe for me to assume by November 1st, when this comes into effect, that our zoning bylaws will be in line with this legislation, so that we're not going to have this conflict?
Yeah, thank you through the chair. As indicated, I think at the previous EASC, it's the intent of staff to bring forward proposed amendments to all zoning bylaws as they relate to the new legislation for both the housing provisions and short-term rental provisions. So in instances where a community wants to be more permissive with short-term rentals, I would assume that by that date, your zoning bylaw would be in line with that, and that we would therefore not be in a position for enforcement or compliance.
Great, thank you.
Okie dokie. So, do we need a receipt motion or anything like that? Tom, what do you think?
Not necessary, but you could.
Not necessary. We won't bother then.
There's more questions.
Oh, there's more questions?
There's more
Oh,
questions.
my goodness. We got a closed session when we're done here, so move along.
I'll try to speak quicker. Question 7, if a short-term rental listing is not listed on a platform such as Airbnb, could it still operate through private bookings or a standalone website? Will these operators be required to register with the province, and will they be monitored for principal residence requirement? The answer to that was the Act applies to short-term rentals being offered to the public, including offers hosted by a platform, which may include Airbnb, VRBO, Expedia, offers on other web listings, which could be Facebook or Marketplace, and listings in classified ads in newspapers. This means that smaller short-term rental platforms offering STRs to the public would fall under the Act and regulations and will need to comply with the new rules. This includes a future requirement to register with the province. So it doesn't matter where you advertise. Apparently, if you are operating STR, you need to be compliant. Question 8. Question.
Winnie, go
Just
ahead.
one
Sorry,
point I wanna-
I have one quick question, and that is that this doesn't actually answer the question about if they have a standalone website. It sounds like if you are operating your STR through a standalone website, then you are fine. There's no repercussions. That's what I was trying to figure out, and it doesn't seem like this, unless the answer is by excluding that answer, maybe you could find more clarity on that too.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Director Vanessa?
Yeah, I was going to point that out as well. And it also seems that if someone has a short-term rental that they're renting out to their friends, informally, that's totally allowed still. Would you say so, Annika?
I don't want to answer that question. I would assume the legislation. I can try to interpret that legislation, but again, this hasn't even been tested yet. It hasn't even been implemented. But if it's not open to the broader public, it shouldn't apply. That should answer the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Question 8. In absence of business licensing, how will zoning compliance be confirmed? As stated above, local governments will continue to be responsible for enforcing their own bylaws, while the Provincial Compliance and Enforcement Unit will be responsible for enforcing the Provincial Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act. It says we are also aware that some local governments may have more restrictive short-term rental rules or zoning than the provincial rules. A process is under development for issuing registration numbers to STRs in these communities through the provincial registry. More details on the registry will be available at a later date. So again, it's not really that clear about in absence of business licensing, how or if they're going to regulate when it comes to an issue of non-compliance with zoning. Question 9, with respect to provincial enforcement measures, what tools will the province use to gain compliance? I.e., will there be enforcement beyond delisting of STR platforms? We've heard from the province that it will be contemplating fines, and how will this be implemented? The answer is a provincial compliance and enforcement unit will be established in the Ministry of Housing, led by a new director to support compliance and enforcement of the new legislation. This new team will support provincial monitoring as well as education and information sharing regarding the new rules. The Act allows for the director to order a compliance order in circumstances where a provision of the Act or regulations has been contravened. It also allows for the director to issue administrative monetary penalties in circumstances where a provision of the Act or regulation has been contravened, there's a failure to comply with an order of the director or a demand issued by the director for production of records, or where there's failure to comply by giving false or misleading information in an investigation. More information on compliance orders and administrative monetary penalties will be available in the forthcoming regulations. In October 2023, at the local level, the Act also increased fines that local governments may use for bylaw enforcement as follows. Maximum fines for regional districts. Offences prosecuted under the Offence Act will increase to $50,000. Maximum fines for local governments may issue under the bylaw enforcement ticket regulations have increased from $1,000 to $3,000 per infraction per day. Question 10, the Act defines short-term rental accommodation service as the service of accommodation in the property of a property host in exchange for a fee that is provided to members of the public for a period of less than 90 consecutive days or another prescribed period, if any, but does not include a prescribed accommodation service. If this is the definition of a short-term rental, how does this differ from a definition of a bed and breakfast? The answer is bed and breakfast accommodations are captured under the Act, meaning they will be subject to the principal residence requirement in applicable communities and will need to register when the provincial registry is developed. Traditional bed and breakfast with the owner or host living in residence could continue to rent an unlimited number of bedrooms and up to one secondary suite or ADU, which aligns with the principal residence requirement.
Quick question, does traditional bed and breakfast mean that they actually serve you breakfast? Is that basically the difference?
I don't know what they mean by traditional. I think, I mean, we can ask for clarity on that, but like we've always said before, there were bed and breakfasts long before there were short-term rentals. So people that were operating bed and breakfasts previously are more, I guess, historic in nature, and we're calling those traditional. They are now more or less similar to where somebody is operating a principal residence STR, where that STR unit is being offered within their actual principal dwelling unit and not in a secondary suite. Technically, bed and breakfasts are within your home, not a secondary suite. So what they're saying is they're going beyond the STR component to now regulate traditional bed and breakfasts in those instances where principal residence requirements are in place to further limit those bed and breakfasts from offering multiple STR units outside of what they offer within their own dwelling unit, which could be as many bedrooms as they want, and just one secondary suite and one additional dwelling unit. So they're just saying that those units that have been historically been termed bed and breakfasts are now required to comply with the short-term rental regulations. Question 11. In an area which has opted in to the principal residence requirement for listings operating with a temporary use permit, but the listing is not a primary residence, would there be provincial action? The answer is in jurisdictions where the provincial principal residence requirements apply, including any who wish to opt in to the principal residence requirement, provincial enforcement of that will apply to the entire jurisdiction and will not be zone specific, with the exception of areas specifically exempt in the Act and regulations, such as farmland or ski resorts. For communities where the principal residence requirement applies, municipalities that currently regulate STRs may consider reviewing and updating business licensing and other bylaws as needed to align with what is permitted under the Act. So the answer appears that even if you're operating under a temporary use permit, you still need to comply with the requirements of the Act. The last question, 12, have you determined drawbacks for which rural areas would not benefit from opting in to the principal residence requirement, and what do you visualize as the most beneficial reason for opting in? The answer is benefits of opting in or out of the principal residence requirement are dependent on the unique needs and circumstances of each community. The biggest advantage from opting in is having provincial enforcement of the provincial principal residence requirement, and broadly the biggest drawback is the inability to create tourist zones that allow commercial STRs to continue to operate with the exception of strata hotels and timeshares. Also note that the regulations allow for eligible communities to opt in to the principal residence requirement on March 31st of each year, so there will be future opportunities to opt in future years. The last point is for clarity, the opt-in process allows exempt communities to opt in to the principal residence requirement under the new short-term rental rules. Other parts of the Act will apply across BC, even in communities where there is no principal residence requirement. For example, applicable short-term rentals across the province will be required to register through a provincial registry system in later phases of the program. More details on the process will be available soon. Thank you.
Thank you. So,
I have a question on that last.
Director
last
Vinesh.
question, Aniko. Yeah, around the biggest advantage point. Just one clarification. And the biggest drawback is the inability to create tourist zones that allow commercial short-term rentals. We can someone can still have zoning for commercial property and run short-term rentals, right? Or someone could, apply to have their property change to a commercial zoning that would allow short-term rentals regardless of principal residence. Am I correct?
Not if you opt in.
Yeah, no, I that's not how I'm interpreting it. But I will ask for, go ahead.
So if we opt in, people who have commercial property can't do short-term rentals?
Not unless they meet the principal residence requirement. That's how I understand it.
Okay, I would love clarification on that then, because that isn't what the sort of.
The opt-in, I would say the focus of the opt-in is under the principal residence. So you can have short-term rentals, but that must be your principal residence. And so if you don't opt in, there's less requirements and you can create those zones within your zoning bylaw because there's less regulation, because we're not required to, right? It's municipalities of 10,000 or more. So they're asking, and they're forced to. So they're saying, do you want those similar requirements? And that is focused on principal residence. So if it's not your principal residence and you have short-term rentals, opting in is going to be a deterrent if that's what you want.
Yeah, I just wasn't confused. If you have commercial property, aren't you allowed to do commercial things on it, like have a hotel or have rooms to rent?
Yeah, so thank you. That was exactly my question. Thank you, through the chair. It won't limit those commercial enterprises from continuing to operate provided they don't meet the definition of a short-term rental. So your tourist commercial zones will still be able to operate cottages, cabins, hotels, motels, whatever doesn't meet the definition within in the Act, but it would not afford somebody to have multiple short-term rental units that don't meet the principal residence requirement. So some property hosts would have to be on site, meet that definition, or a supplier host, and you would be limited to your principal dwelling plus either a secondary suite or an accessory dwelling unit. You would not be able to have additional short-term rental units operating on that parcel of commercial land, even if you had your property host on site, because they're limiting that. So as long as we're interpreting their answer correctly, yeah, that would impact somebody with a commercial property.
That's concerning for me. It doesn't feel like the spirit of what the legislation is. Would you mind confirming that?
Yeah, for sure.
I would just love to have that really crystal clear. Thank you.
Okay, Director Mooney.
Thank you, Chair. And I think my question is really related to that, because if there is a commercial property which is operating cabins, I mean, is a cabin considered a short-term rental? It feels like maybe. And in my understanding of this throughout the whole process is that we were really focused on, and that the act was focused on residential zoning and residential properties
Yeah.
and properties that were being used as residences that may no longer being used as residences, but were now becoming commercial in nature. So, and trying to sort of bring that back into alignment with the fact that homes are for living in. And so when we're now talking about commercial zones being potentially impacted, that seems to be quite broader. So I would really like some more clarity on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for that. What I think they're trying to say here, and I think we might be maybe misinterpreting this a little bit, is that as a way to work around the existing legislation, a local government coming in and just slopping a commercial zone on that property and then saying, well, the principal residence requirement doesn't come into play. I think that's what it's referring to. So saying just these normal properties that are currently residential in nature, that are now subject to this, the principal residence requirement, not being able to circumvent that. If it's an existing commercial zone that operates an operation that meets the definition of a commercial tourist accommodation, they could not limit that use on the property. But I'll ask them to provide the answer maybe with a little more clarity.
Thank you.
And I think my final question is around, like what you were saying about temporary, we were talking about commercial zoning, and I'm curious about temporary use permits, because in fact, in my limited understanding, temporary use permit could be something that somebody could apply for as an interim measure if they were considering changing zoning. And if there was a temporary use permit in place that provided, would that be potentially a way of a theoretically non-compliant residential property being used as a commercial operation? Because they would then be paying, would they be paying different taxes, or how does that, would they be able to have a temporary use permit to operate?
Thank you, through the chair. I think you need to provide that question again, because that was what we were trying to get an answer for in question 11. And so maybe if you were able to reformulate your question, we can ask it again, because I'm not sure what answer we're looking for at this time, because we did ask if an area that has opted, I mean, this is if they opt in, mind you, to the principal residence, and they're operating with a temporary use permit, but it's not their principal residence, would there be provincial action? And the province is saying, well, yes, because you are required to adhere to the principal residence requirement. So I'm not sure what your question is if it's not that.
I don't know how, if you opt in, you would circumnavigate the principal residence under temporary use. I don't know how you could do that.
It would just be strictly a rezoning.
Well, again, I think it goes back to primary use. Like, if you're your primary residence, if you're not living there, I don't think there's anything that you're going to be able to, no loophole that you're going to be able to short-term rent that if you opt in.
I think what I'm wondering about is for people who do not live there and may be interested in rezoning their property so that they can continue to operate it as, like you talked before about having commercial zoning that would be separate than residential zoning.
Right. And so I think your answer is already provided to you in both question 11 and 12. You cannot use a temporary use permit to avoid having to comply to the principal residence requirement, nor can we use our zoning powers to zone lands for commercial use to not conform to the principal residence requirement. I feel it's quite clear, but I can certainly ask.
Unless the rezoning to commercial is truly commercial. I think what Annika was saying is
Yeah.
you can't take a single-family dwelling because you want it to be a short-term rental and say, oh, now that's commercial use. That trick has been taken out of our bag here. So, you're not going to go around and go, okay, all you people who individually want to have short-term rentals, but it's not your primary use, we'll just call you guys all commercial. The province is saying that you can't do that.
Yeah, and further, they've taken away the grandfathering ability of the Local Government Act as well. So, I mean, in previous years, someone could potentially be grandfathered and not have to comply to the legislation. They have removed that when it comes to short-term rentals. So it doesn't matter how long somebody's been potentially operating outside of the parameters of this new legislation, there's no more grandfathering. You are no longer considered legally non-conforming. You must comply. And there is no other way to use temporary use permits or zoning powers to avoid that principal residence requirement where you either opt in or you're non-exempt from the beginning.
Okay. So for the benefit of the public, to put this staff report on short-term rentals, maybe we could have a motion for receipt, and that'll put it in the minutes so the public can see it.
Move receipt.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? And that's carried. So now we're at closed session, receipt of the CEO's report.
Move receipt.
Seconder, please.
Second.
All right. Call a question. All in favor? That's carried. And then the recommendation that the meeting be closed to the public to consider matters deemed to fall within the parameters of sections 91 NNO